I'm sure for most of you, Fintan O'Toole requires no introduction, but I did a bit of research on him this morning on the internet, and I'm going to give you his seed-breathing generation now. As you know, Fintan is a columnist, literary editor, and drama critic with the Irish Times. But I think more importantly, he's been a commentator on and writer on the politics and social issues in Irish society for over 30 years. I think if I was to read you some of the titles of the books, which is what struck me today when I was looking, some of whom have graced my shelf at home, it'll give you a sense of the gambit and range of issues that have been talked about. A Mass for Jesse James, a journey through the 1980s Ireland, dealing with poverty and immigration. Meanwhile, back at the ranch, the politics of Irish beef. Remember that? We thought we learnt lots of lessons then. The Black Hole, Green Card, the disappearance of Ireland in the 1990s. Ships of Fools, how stupidity and corruption sank the Celtic Tiger. Enough is Enough, how to build a new republic. And in that, he presents some picture of what the Ireland that we all aspire for should look like. It's a great pleasure on behalf of all of you to welcome Fintan O'Toole to talk to us about challenging our thinking and developing a shared vision.
Thanks very much indeed, and thanks very much for the invitation to join you on what's, I know is a very important day. I know in any field it's very difficult to get a day out from the daily grind to try to look at the bigger picture and think about change. And I'm very privileged to be asked to contribute to that if I can at all. So over the next 3 hours or so, I'd just like to give you some reflections on where we are, really, both as a society and in relation to education. It would be nice to think that you could start something like this by taking it for granted that both education and social justice are values in themselves, which don't require any outside justification. They're values in themselves because they're critical to human dignity. You know, people can't live dignified lives without education. Education is what, in its different forms, you know, throughout every society, it's the way in which people learn to be members of a community, to have a function and a role and a standing in that community. And social justice is at the heart of an idea of equality. And we know time and time again that inequality itself is toxic to the human spirit, that it has really fundamental effects on every aspect of human dignity. And I said it would be nice just to be able to say those things and go home and to sort of, you know, to accept that these are fundamental values. But I think we're all very conscious of the fact that we live in an age when saying that anything is worthwhile for its own sake gets you nowhere. And we have to argue in some way about the usefulness of certain kinds of values and certain institutions and certain kinds of investments for the kind of society that we want to see. So let's just maybe begin by standing back a little bit from the current crisis. It's a crisis which is very profound, which I think is very long-term, but it's not going to last forever. And we're not, also, I would argue, we're not going to actually get out of the crisis without some pretty radical thinking. And look at really very simple thing about what's going to create sustainable prosperity in Ireland. And we pretty much know the answer, at least we know one of the things that's going to be absolutely at the centre of any viable answer, and that's education. We live in an increasingly competitive world. I've been spending the last couple of years part of my time in Princeton in the United States, and every day when I walk down to the campus to work, there are tour buses pulling up, and large numbers of Chinese people get off the tour buses and take photographs of a university, you know, as if they were at the Statue of Liberty or as if it were Disneyland, you know, some kind of tourist attraction. It's what they want to see. And it reminds you every day when you see that actually we live in a world which is increasingly competitive in relation to how people see education. People around the world aspire to very high educational standards. And in that context, a country like Ireland faces a really fundamental challenge. And that challenge is that we're either moving forward in terms of our educational achievements and standards, or we're moving back. Standing still and saying we've done a fantastic job, we've one of the best education systems in the world, which we keep repeating to ourselves even though it's not true, that is a recipe for an increasing lack of competitiveness in the contemporary world. And so we face a really basic question as a society, which is how do we see ourselves as a place which has a sufficient competitive edge to sustain prosperity into the future? And it seems to me to be reasonably obvious that we can't do this without substantial investment in education and without taking very seriously the need for our educational standards to improve enormously. This challenge is very severe, but I think we can also look at it with a certain kind of optimism. I'm very conscious that I'm standing here today with you because of very radical decisions that were made about education in Ireland when I was 10 years old. I was born in 1958. Like I'm sure many of you, nobody in my family had ever gone to second level school, never mind to a university. When I was born, it was probably unthinkable that second level education would become the norm in this society. And yet, very radical, and we tend to forget, a very controversial decision was made in 1968 to open up second level education, to get rid of fees for second level schools, particularly for the bulk of the second level system. And that had an enormous effect on my life and on the lives subsequently of millions and millions of Irish people. And the circumstances in which those decisions were made were not much more favourable than the ones we're in now. It's certainly true that Ireland was in a situation of relative boom in the 1960s, but compared to the standards of living that we enjoy even in crisis now, the boom of the 1960s looked pretty poor. We were still well below, any kind of international measures of human development, standards of living. Ireland was in relative terms a poor country, and yet we were able in the 1960s to make some very radical decisions about education, which had very positive effects. And it is worth remembering that education in Ireland is a success story. It's a highly qualified success story. It's one that we can be extremely critical of. But nevertheless, over a period of 35, 40 years, we have done pretty extraordinary things in Irish education. We've utterly transformed the educational opportunities of the majority of the population over that time. And we've done so while maintaining reasonably decent international standards of educational output. And at a time when, talking about state intervention is taboo, talking about the public sector as if it has anything positive to contribute is taboo, we need to remind ourselves, that teachers, schools, educational institutions at every level in Ireland have actually done an extraordinary job of expanding very, very rapidly, of meeting very severe challenges over that period of time, and of doing that in a way which has, as I said, had a really positive effect on the lives of millions of Irish people. So the education system in Ireland is perfectly capable of meeting severe challenges, and the political system, if it prioritises education, is perfectly capable of making radical decisions, even in relatively tough times. So that, I think, is the overall context in which we have to try to think about what the role of education in Ireland currently is. And as we think about that, I think we face a very simple question. Where are improvements in Irish education going to come from? How would you measure them? Well, you can measure them in two ways. You can measure them in terms of the quality of education, what it is we do, and you can measure it in terms of the quantity of education, In other words, how many people are reaching what standards of education by the end of their educational careers. I'll talk about the quality issue in a moment, but the quantity challenge is in some ways very simple and very stark. And it's a different kind of challenge, I would suggest, to the one that we have faced over the last 20, 25 years. Over the last 25 years, if you really look at it, what was the big challenge that Irish education tried to face? It was to get more and more middle-class people into universities. You know, that effectively, it was never stated, but that's effectively what we did. And we did it very, very successfully. We've done it so successfully that you could say that the upper and middle classes in Ireland are almost reaching saturation point in terms of participation in third level education. There are not too many people left who are in the upper echelons of Irish society who do not have the opportunity to go to third level education. And this has very stark consequences. It means that if we're going to improve the quantitative performance of Irish education, then we can't do that by getting more of the low-hanging fruit. We can't do it simply by getting more people coming from professional, middle-class, relatively well-to-do backgrounds into third-level education, because we're already doing that. Yes, there are some improvements you can make there, but they're not going to be transformative, or they're not going to be sufficient to meet the challenge of the 21st century. So therefore, the conclusion we have to draw is, and it's pretty obvious, I think, is that what we have to start doing is a rather different kind of challenge, which is how do we get people who are not currently in a position to avail of high-level qualifications into positions where they can do so. And this obviously is a question of social justice, it's a question of equality, but it's also, I would suggest, a really fundamental question of economic progress. When I was starting out in journalism, there was a phrase that was used about Irish agriculture where the European Union was paying lots of farmers not to grow crops, and it was called set aside. And we've always had in Ireland a human set aside. You know, we set aside large amounts of our human potential. We consign large numbers of people to being the equivalent of fields that don't grow crops. People who are condemned, in a sense, to not being productive members of society because they're not allowed to be. And it seems to me to be rather obvious that if we're going to think about Ireland in 20 years' time as a place with sustainable prosperity, we have to stop doing human set-aside. And the fundamental way in which we can do that is through education. Not through education standing on its own. I think every one of you knows in your own work much better than I do that education can't be divorced from people's lives, it can't be divorced from housing, it can't be divorced from employment, it can't be divorced from poverty. But education itself is a key measure of whether or not we're making progress in relation to these things. So what we face, I think, is a rather interesting situation. For the last 30 years, broadly speaking, and this is a sweeping generalization, but that's the kind of stuff I do. For the last 30 years or so, it's been possible to sustain educational progress while paying relatively little attention to social justice. Because there was a huge unmet educational demand on the part of the middle classes, you could be making educational progress in those quantitative terms while leaving very many people outside the system. Now, looking forward to the next 25, 30 years, that's not possible. You can't do it. You simply can't get a larger proportion of your society into levels of serious educational achievement while leaving behind those who are in poverty, those who are in unemployment, those who are in conditions of structural inequality. So this faces us with a very different kind of challenge. It faces us with a challenge where the distinction between educational and therefore economic advancement on the one side and social justice on the other side is no longer tenable. So we have to change the mindset. Right? The dominant mindset is still one in which we see economic progress as being the condition for social justice. So what we say is We've got to have a thriving, booming economy, and then we'll have enough money to be able to look after poverty and inequality and to take those things really seriously. If we remain stuck in that mindset, we're actually going to go nowhere for the reasons that I've been talking about. What we have to say is that our economic future, if it does lie largely through education, then it also lies through social justice. That we can't see these things as being separate tracks. And this, I think, is where your work is of such crucial importance. The old VC system, which is now being given new institutional forms, has two great virtues behind it. One is that at the core of the system has always been a commitment to social inclusion, which has not always been the case with the classic mainstream secondary education system, for example. And the second thing is that it has a history of educational innovation, because you've had to do social innovation, you've got to do social inclusion, you've also had to think more broadly about education and what its values are, what its functions are, how it works. And I think it's those two basic commitments, that commitment to educational innovation on the one side and social inclusion on the other side, that can form the basis not just for your work in the period ahead, but I think actually have to form the basis for any vision of where our society can be over the next 25 years. And again, we have to stop thinking of these things as if they're separate compartments. In relation to social justice, there's really no substitute for money. It's not what people want to hear right now. All the slogans are about doing less with more. Rather doing more with less. I think it was a Freudian slip. Doing more with less. And of course, every institution, every culture, every way of doing things, there's always a period in which you can, in fact, improve the way you do it. You can improve it. You can improve efficiencies. You can squeeze resources. You can get more out of what you have. But there's a limit to that process, and we have to face as a society that we're right up against that limit. And we're right up against that limit in a number of our systems, including our education system. We are not going to improve our education system to the degree that we need to do so by giving it less money. There needs to be serious, consistent, long-term investment. And that serious long-term investment has to be allied to a vision. Right? So it has to be, you don't just put money in for the sake of it. You put money in to say, what is it we want to achieve? And again, in relation to this, we need to change the discourse. So just as we need to change the discourse that says you've got social justice on the one side and educational and economic advancement on the other side, we also need to change the discourse around what the goals of investment might be. If we turn around and we say that it is acceptable and permissible and indeed necessary, for example, to invest in sewage systems or water systems because they're a tangible investment with returns, how much more can we say that educational investment carries with it extraordinary returns? It carries with it returns of a very obvious nature in terms of personal development, in terms of personal happiness, in terms of personal opportunity. It carries returns in terms of social cohesion and social equality. But it also carries absolutely enormous fiscal and economic returns. Even if you think about it in terms of the dominant thing that we're talking about right now, which is fiscal responsibility, we have to accept that it is fiscally irresponsible not to invest in education. It actually costs enormous amounts of money over the medium term to stint on proper, well-managed, well-thought-through investment. And that investment has to be focused then. And the question is, what do we need to focus it on? And I would suggest we need to focus it on two things. One is on teachers. It's rather unfashionable to say this, I think. Everybody's talking about technology, resources, all the rest of it, all of which are fantastic and wonderful and necessary. But the overwhelming resource in education is teachers. The confidence, the quality, the creativity of teachers is, to me, 90% of what makes education systems succeed and fail. And you don't get that confidence and creativity if at the same time you're treating teachers with contempt, if you're casualizing the profession, if you're making teachers feel like they're parasites on society. We need a revolution in teaching. We absolutely do. We need to demand incredibly high standards of our teachers. But we're not going to get those very high standards if we put teachers in boxes, if we bring in a culture where teachers feel that they're being invigilated all the time, they're being watched all the time, they're not being trusted, and as I said, they're being treated as if they're kind of just a drain on public resources. Investment in teaching and teachers, to me, is absolutely at the core of what we need to do. And again, you don't invest money without expecting a return. What return should we expect from teachers? Well, we should expect teachers to be confident, to be creative, and to be critical, because that's what we want our students to be. We want the people who come out of education systems to be confident, creative, and critical. And that's not going to happen if they're being taught by people who are undermined, whose creativity is being squashed, and whose right to critical thinking is being denied. So we have to do education according to the way that we want education to be. The second thing we need then is to focus those resources. I said the first thing is focus it on teaching. The second thing we need to focus it on is on social equality. We know, I mean, it's long, we're in the 21st century, we've study after study after study has been done, has shown the returns on investment in increasing social equality through education. Those returns are actually far better established than economic returns from every other kind of investment. I'm sure anybody in business will tell you that most economic investments are enormously risky. There's a big chance that they won't pay off. The market will change. You'll get unlucky. Something will go wrong. Your product won't work. There is no case that I know of globally where significant investment over a period of time that's well managed and well structured in education has not had a return. It's the safest investment you can make. And that return is even leaving aside all of the returns for their own sake. Just looking at it purely economically and fiscally, the returns are absolutely enormous. It reduces pretty much every other kind of public spending. That's what education does. It's an extraordinary kind of spending, because if you spend properly on education, you have to spend less on almost every other major area of spending. Your social welfare spend ends up being less because you don't have the same unemployment rates. Your health spending ends up being less because people who are better educated and who have better access to economic opportunities have far better health outcomes. Every area, you look at housing and the way housing can be integrated. You look at the way cities develop. You can look across the board at pretty much every other area of public spending, and you can say actually a really good way to reduce that spending in the future is to invest in education now. So there is an enormous challenge for Ireland in terms of education. And it's a challenge which I think is as much conceptual as it is political. It actually requires us to change the way in which we talk about the role of education in society. It requires us to stop thinking about education as a piece of public spending and start thinking about it as a piece of public investment. It requires us to stop thinking about social justice and economics as if they're different things. And it requires us to stop thinking about the quantity of education that we have as something that's different from the issues of quality. Those three challenges are absolutely enormous, but we have terrific resources to draw on in relation to the way in which we meet them as a society. We have educational institutions, we have teachers, we have schools all over the country, which are doing absolutely phenomenal work day in, day out, in terms of meeting enormous difficulties in enormously challenging circumstances. And it seems to me to be something that we can set for ourselves as a goal, that we can maximize those potentials, those resources, that energy, that inspiration, and we can put it at the heart of what we do as a society. The Taoiseach has said that he would like Ireland to be thought of by 2016 as the best little country in the world to do business, which is, of course, a perfectly good aspiration. But I suggest we're not going to be the best little country in the world to do business unless we're also the best little country in the world to be a student, to be educated, to be part of a lifelong process whereby education itself is seen as an absolutely central social value. On the other hand, if we do make that kind of investment and that kind of commitment, I think we can also begin to look a little bit up from the abyss that we're in at the moment. We can set ourselves real achievable goals. And the sense that we can achieve things, I think, is also in itself an enormous economic resource. The confidence has gone out of this society in many, many ways. And it has to be brought back. And one of the ways we can bring it back, I think, is by saying that we're absolutely serious about education, and we're serious about education as being a right, a social value that applies equally to all our citizens. I think if we could say that and really mean it, we would be at least some of the way towards being the kind of republic that the people who set up the state imagined it would be 100 years after they engaged in attempting to establish it. Thanks very much.